everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kaya, and as you guys know, I make videos about Italy, specifically Milan, but today I wanted to make a video that's about the differences between the north and the south of Italy, because I spent time in both parts of Italy, and from what I've heard from the Italians that I've met and the kind of lifestyle that the north leads versus what the south leads, and just little differences that I noticed, I wanted to make a video because I guess I had a lot of preconceived ideas before I went to Italy about Italy, and I wasn't really, I guess, aware of these specific differences. I guess I went in with an idea because I did a couple of subjects in university before I went to Italy, kind of about the north and south divide and what that kind of means, what that kind of looks like in a practical sense, but I didn't really know, you know, the nitty-gritty, the kind of everyday life kind of differences. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, because I found that when I was learning about them, I found them to be quite interesting, and I think a lot of you guys will feel the same way, or I hope so if you clicked on this video. So let's just get straight into the things. I've come up with 10. Well, I mean, I haven't come up with them, but I have curated 10 different things that I found to be differences, and yeah, let's just get straight into the video. So the first thing that I want to talk about is punctuality. Now, I guess you always hear the stereotype of Italians in general always being late and not really having like any concept of time, and not really placing any importance on time, or, you know, being on time, getting at a place on time, etc. But I noticed there was a significant difference between the north and the south of Italy in terms of punctuality. So if you guys have never been to Italy before, the north of Italy is dominated by industrial style work, whereas the south is more dominated by agricultural based work. In the north, I would say Milan specifically, there's kind of more of a bit of a rush and bush, like hustle and bustle mentality, and you get that kind of feeling when you're in the city, like people are moving fast, and you can tell that people, you know, have places to be at certain times, and the thought of stopping on the street to speak with someone, you know, for a long period of time that isn't just like over coffee in the morning, I guess isn't seen as rude, but it just seems as if it may be an inconvenience to someone else's day, is like slowing their morning down or whatever through small talk, or like talking for too long if you run into someone you know on the street, rather than just, you know, a passing hello or, you know, how are you. It seems more of an inconvenience to their day, and people might even avoid, you know, doing small talk in the mornings, like in the work mornings, as it may even be considered rude or inconvenient, and, you know, like slowing down their morning and getting in the way of the things that they need to do, places they need to be, etc, etc. Whereas in the south, this mentality is completely different. You often hear Italians say things like, you know, even if you're on the way to a job interview, they'll still make time to talk to their friends in the street if they run into them, and, you know, they'll give people that time of day. Not to say the northerners don't give people time of day, that's not really an accurate representation, and that's obviously a bit of a stereotype, but in general what I found was that in the south things are a lot more relaxed and slow paced, and especially in terms of like dinner meetings and like bookings and things like that. If you want someone to be there on time, tell them the time is like half an hour or an hour before, to make sure that everyone turns up on time. Otherwise you'll find that a lot of the time, in the south in particular, but this is kind of, I guess, an Italian thing, mentality, is like being on time doesn't necessarily mean being there on the dot. It's like it could be 15 minutes late, it could be 20 minutes late, half an hour late. That's kind of normal in Italian culture. I remember my first instance with this was at my visa appointment at the Italian consulate in Sydney before I even went to Italy, and I remember I was there at my appointment like 15 minutes early or something. It was like 8:45, my appointment was at 9 o'clock, and no one was in the office yet. And I remember this guy, one of the Italian guys that worked there, he walked in, like got off the elevator, and I was already standing in the lobby kind of like waiting for my appointment, and he said to me, "Do you know that we don't open until 9 o'clock?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm just here a bit early, you know, usually come a bit early for my appointments. You never know, that kind of thing. Like, I didn't want to take any risks with my visa appointment, so I was there, you know, 10 minutes early, 10-15 minutes early. And just the sheer like shock on his face that I was there that little bit early just indicated to me that, you know, it's not really a part of their culture to be really early for things, or, you know, be waiting for too long for things. So yeah, that's one difference that I noticed between the north and the south of Italy. So yeah, that's one thing that I noticed between the north and the south of Italy, was their punctuality when it comes to like appointments, and even just like not being in such a rush in the south, and then in the north where it's more like rushing around and needing to be places at a certain time, and I guess just having more of a stress on time rather than in the south where it's a lot more relaxed, I found. The second one, I guess, ties into the first one a little bit, and it's the eating time. So in general, you've probably heard that Italians eat dinner quite late, and it can be a bit of a stereotype, but it's really true. Like, I remember, I think back to my first day in Milan, when I first arrived there, and it was a Sunday, mind you, but it was like, I remember we were looking for like somewhere to eat for dinner, and all these places closed for a couple of hours during the afternoon, and then they were going to reopen again at like 7:30, and that was like the absolute earliest that you can go out for dinner on some nights. Like Sunday obviously maybe a little bit different, but in general Italians eat quite late, and instead Italians eat quite late, but in saying that though, 7:30 for a southerner, for example, is really, really early for dinner. I remember when I went to the south of Italy and I stayed at my boyfriend's place in the south in Basilicata. They were lucky if they had dinner by like 8:30, 9 o'clock. Like, that's just kind of like the standard time to eat dinner, and that's if you're eating at home. Like, if you're eating out, you could be going out for dinner at like 10, 11 p.m, you know, depending on what day of the week it is. And, you know, if you're going out that night, for example, it might even be, you might even eat dinner at 11 o'clock. Like, it really just depends, I guess, what you're doing. But it's like unheard of to eat dinner at 7 p.m, or like in Australia, how we think like 6, 7, you know, 8 p.m. latest for dinner in Australia, whereas in Italy, particularly in the south of Italy, there is, you know, they eat dinner really, really late. And compared to the north, who may eat dinner, you know, a little bit earlier than the south, I found. So the third thing that I'm going to talk about is dialect. Now, I believe Italy became a nation in 1861, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but before this time, Italy was divided into a lot of different like smaller countries, I guess you would say, and they were ruled by completely different people. They may not have even been Italians, they could have been like French, and who the country was ruled by deeply influenced, you know, the language and the dialect, the way that they speak, and how the language kind of developed in specific regions of Italy. And it's so strange, like looking on a map, comparing it to Australia, where our states are kind of, they're very straightly divided. They're not very like they don't kind of go like this. Whereas in Italy, if you look at Italy on a map and you look at all the different regions and how they're kind of divided, they kind of even like go into each other, and they're very non-linear. It's very like curvy, and the regions kind of like go in and out and up and down, and it's definitely not a straight line. Because Italy wasn't a unified nation until that time, they have still a very strong and distinct dialect according to their region. So given that, for example, the dialect from central Italy is considered like Italian, like normal Italian language these days, it makes sense that people from central Italy and more northern Italy are easier to understand for people like me who are coming to Italy, learning you know, a bit of the Italian language. They are much easier to understand than people, say, from the south of Italy, whose regional dialects are very much so a lot of it doesn't sound like the Italian language. You know, some words do, but some words are completely made up, and it may not even be Italian, or, you know, like the kind of thing that we have in Australia, where it's kind of like you use slang, but it's not actually a real word, and you can't really explain where it comes from sometimes. It just kind of is what it is. So that's one thing that I noticed that was a massive difference between the north and the south, was the dialects, and not even between the north and south, but even between different regions. But particularly me coming from Australia, I noticed the biggest difference between the north and the south of Italy. And it was funny, when I came back, I actually work with an Italian lady, and she's from like near Venice, that kind of area. And so because that's like more central Italy, and I spent a lot of time in the south of Italy, I'd picked up a lot of southern dialect, like different words from the south, because I spent a lot of time there. And I remember I was speaking to her one time, and I think I blurted out one of the like southern dialect words that I learned, and she just had no idea what I was talking about, and I had to think back and like retrace my steps and realize that it actually was southern dialect and it wasn't Italian. So there can be like a lot of barriers in terms of language. I guess, you know, you always retreat back to normal Italian, like that's what I kind of had to do in the south of Italy. Even though I'm not fluent in Italian, it was easier for me to understand Italian, obviously, than it was for me to understand the southern dialect. So yeah, there's quite a difference in the different dialects in Italy for those specific reasons, which I found to be quite interesting. The next thing I'm going to talk about is tradition. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of this, and the reason why I say there's quite a difference in, you know, traditional elements between the north and the south of Italy, is that in my apartment where I lived in Milan, I lived next door to this old Italian lady, and her name was Clara, and she was from the south of Italy in a place called Battipaglia, and she often used to, you know, ring on my doorbell, and she would like ask me to help her fold her washing, and she would ask me to go to the markets with her on the weekends, in the mornings, and just various things like that. She would ask me over for coffee, and I wrote a blog post about this, actually, was like communicating beyond language barriers, because her being from Battipaglia again is like another dialect in and of itself. So when she was speaking, she was very different to how the northerners would speak, and she was very traditional in the way that she was. And even though I couldn't understand her and she couldn't really understand me, we still found that kind of way to communicate, which was really interesting. And that was one of the biggest things in Italy that I learnt, was, you know, to dig a little bit deeper and to try and understand things, even though I may not understand the words that they're speaking. So yeah, when I say it's a bit of a difference between the north and the south of Italy, is like, when you think of the south of Italy, you think of, you know, people hanging their washing off their balcony, and you can see it from the streets. And I just think of the example of Sicily, when I went to Sicily, and it was like all the old buildings. And, you know, even though in the north there's a lot of old buildings, you know, throughout the entire Italy there's old buildings, but in the north, you know, you don't really see that, you know, the washing hanging off people's lines outside from the streets and things like that. Whereas in places like Sicily and you know, smaller towns in the south of Italy, like the very, very south of Italy, you see that kind of thing. And it's just kind of like a more traditional way of living. But in saying that though, in the north of Italy they do still have like lots of street markets and things like that, which I found to be, you know, it's quite a traditional, I guess like wholesome way to live. And like, you know, you go out on a couple of days per week and you go to the fresh fruit and vegetable markets, and it's like, you know, all the people, the local you know, butchers and people who sell like fruit and vegetables, and they're all like there selling their local produce. And I don't know, I just found that to be so wholesome, and that's kind of something that links all of Italy is like, you know, those little markets that they have such a passion for food, and it really shines through despite the differences between you know, different traditions and things like that, which I found to be really beautiful and really quite interesting. And that's something that I miss a lot about Italy actually, is like you know, the different ways of life and how it's kind of a lot slower and slower paced and things like that. The next thing that I want to talk about is family life. So one example that comes to my mind, and I guess I am talking about like anecdotes here, like my own personal stories and experiences, but that's really all I have to go off. So I'm just going to talk about this example in terms of family life, is like, because I spent a lot of time in the south of Italy and I stayed with my boyfriend and his family there. They live in a really small town called Palazzo San Gervasio, which is in Basilicata in the south of Italy, and it's one of those places where you can literally walk anywhere. Like you can walk from one side of the town to the other, and everyone's house is like really close together and things like that, so everyone knows everyone. And you know, that means also that a lot of the people in the town, their workplace is really close as well, like within walking distance. So one thing that was really nice was that a lot of the time the whole family would come back and, you know, from work on their lunch break, and they'd all sit at home and eat lunch together if, you know, the whole family was there, for example. So I found that to be really nice, and just like that family dynamic, that family life is different in the south because of that reason, because, you know, the towns tend to be a lot smaller compared to the north. Say if you live in Milan, where it's a little bit tricky, you know, to come home. You can't really just come home for an hour for lunch, you know, unless you happen to live really close to your workplace, for example, which is less likely as it is like a bigger city, and things like that. So that's another thing that I noticed was a difference between the north and the south of Italy. Another thing that I noticed was universities. So even though, you know, there are students who go to universities in more southern parts of Italy, most of the universities in Italy are in the north of Italy, or like central to the north of Italy. So a lot of students from the south actually travel from the south to the north and stay there and live there for, you know, 3 years or 4 years to study. So in terms of university life, it's quite different. You know, students are told at school, you know, when you go to study, like you know, for more opportunities and things like that, if you don't want to necessarily work in like agricultural sector or things like that, if you want to study economics or psychology or finance or anything like that, a lot of them tend to go to the north of Italy to do that. So in terms of university life, that's one other difference that I noticed, was depending on, you know, what kind of work you want to do, what kind of thing you want to study. A lot of southerners tend to move to the north to study, as there's more, you know, universities there, generally more like work opportunities and things like that there. The next thing I want to talk about is rules and regulations. Now this one it made me laugh because, again, talking about my own personal experience from the north to the south, well, I guess it depends as well. Like in the south, if you're in a really small town, like in the back streets, things like that, a lot of them don't wear seatbelts in the car, which I always would anyway. Like I always just, like, you know, it's second nature to put your seatbelt on when you're driving around in the car. So it just, every time I would get in the car in the south, I would always like put my seatbelt on. But when we were in like the really small parts of town and we were just like driving around the corner kind of thing, a lot of them like don't wear seatbelts, and the road rules are, I guess, a lot more lenient compared to the north of Italy, even though, you know, there are road rules obviously. Italians just tend to be a little bit more, what's the word, gung-ho on the roads, but in saying that though, they are, you know, quite good and quite experienced drivers. So yeah, that's one difference I noticed between the north and the south of Italy in terms of like driving and like rules and regulations. There tend to be, you know, in the north of Italy, in big cities obviously, there tend to be more like police officers around and things like that. So yeah, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is weather. So in terms of weather differences between the north and the south of Italy, in general, the north doesn't get as hot as the south of Italy. Like their summers aren't as hot, even though they are quite hot. Like Milan gets stinking hot because it doesn't get any wind, like there's no breeze. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's because the Alps, because it's so close to the Alps, like in the north of Italy and like the Switzerland and things like that, it kind of blocks any breeze or wind that kind of area. So it does get quite hot in Milan, but if there was a breeze it wouldn't be nearly as hot. Whereas in the south of Italy they tend to have like warmer summers, and even like just looking at the people from the north and the south of Italy, a lot of them from the south have like, you know, darker features. They have like darker complexions a lot of the time, even darker eyes and darker hair. So that's where I'm going to end today's video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Make sure to subscribe for new videos every week, and I'll see you very soon in my next one. Bye!